Okay, thank you so much. I started being interested in nature once again in 2016. There was a lot of divisiveness, as you know, during the campaign, and there was a certain segment of society that believed that their freedom of expression included throwing epithets. And now it was happening more often to Asian Americans, and I found that it went beyond the usual go back to where you came from, which is Oakland, and that it included a lot of rude behavior, ignoring me when they were serving other people. And it made me aware that maybe this had been there all along, but now it was overt because people had permission, it seemed. So that put me into a state of despair, and I needed to do something to counter it. And I decided that I would do something I'd been promising myself since I was in my 30s or 40s, and that was to start drawing, which is something that I loved to do as a child. And now here I was about age 65 or so, 64, and I was never going to retire from my work as a fiction writer. So I decided I would take nature journaling classes and go into nature and just take my mind off of what was going on in the country. Just so you know what this backyard is, this is what would be called a woodland habitat. There are oak trees, there's understory, the vegetation underneath, there's a flower garden in part of it, and there is a green roof. And I like to think of that green roof as almost being the flyway sign that says, turn left, Amy's Bistro is right here. I started making bird cages that would keep out certain big birds like crows and scrub jays, and then I started buying food for different kinds of birds. It went from sunflower seeds to hot pepper sunflower seeds, hot pepper suet, walnuts that were chopped up, and it even progressed to pathology. It was mealworms, live mealworms. I would buy them in large amounts, and at one point it was like 20,000 at a time. And I have a very understanding husband. We've been together for 50 years, and that is testament of what it takes to have a long, happy marriage. Because I had to take these mealworms and put them in separate containers. So these live things that I dug out of the bag and put them in smaller containers, and then in the refrigerator where they would sort of hibernate and not progress to the next stage, which would turn them into beetles. And as you see, I had, Alaskan taste water that says, Dunkin' drunk, why go all the way to the north for melted snowcap? We have floods of water here. Of course, that's kind of not a funny joke in many respects, but tying into colon ice. This is 10,000 live mealworms times $400. You can imagine when I got up to 20,000. Some of the birds that are in the yard, these are birds that are found in California. You might have some of them. You have a blue jay, we have a scrub jay. That's a baby, what you call a fledgling scrub jay. Anna's hummingbird, you have probably ruby-throated here. And a very, very young fledgling dark-eyed junco, which you have here as well, and great horned owls, which you also have here. Now, these birds have something in common, and look at them and see if you could determine what that is. These birds have that same thing, almost all of them, in common. What is in common is they're all looking at me. And that is something that I found with all the birds in the backyard, that if I was inside the house and could see the birds, you can guarantee that the birds could see me. And when I stepped out, often they would look at me, and I started capturing these pictures. What was wonderful is when the birds were feeding or when they were bathing or just perched somewhere, if I looked at them, eventually they would stare at me straight on, and I would take a picture. And for every bird that looked at me, they became part of the journal. I only drew birds that are in the yard, and I only drew these detailed portraits of birds that looked at me. And to me, that signified that we had a relationship. And it wasn't friendship. It wasn't that they trusted me absolutely. It meant that I was simply part of their environment and part of their world, and they were part of mine. I think that what they saw me as was the flightless large creature who brings food. And I know that to be true. Because there was one time I had to take the food down and they kept following me. So when I started drawing, as I said, I gave up drawing, but there was not a lot of encouragement. Here's one from my art teacher in high school: lacks imagination or drive, which are necessary to a deeper creative level. It's a very weird sentence, for one thing. Or drive, imagination or drive, what is that? I mean, what's the relationship there? Anyway, not a good prognosis for a fiction writer or somebody who's going to draw birds. And I did take drawing classes. A lot of people think this just springs out of my fingertips, and I'm able to do this without any lessons whatsoever. But in fact, I put in a lot of what we call pencil miles, which is practice, thousands of hours of pencil miles, drawing every single day, looking at different angles of birds and the relative shapes that you can see by doing negative space exercises. The person that was my teacher was John Muir Laws. You can go to his website, and he has the classes that I took. They're videotaped, and they're there for free. So if you want to learn to do this, you can go there. He had one bit of advice that I just loved, and that was, when you look at the bird and you're going to draw that bird, feel the bird as if you're petting it or, running your hands over it, but also feel the life force of that bird. Now, being a fiction writer, I took that one step forward and I became the bird. I'm imagining I'm that bird looking at me, the flightless creature with the food, or looking at tree limbs or other birds that are in the sky. And you'll notice with smaller birds, like the hummingbird or even chickadees and such, they're constantly scanning the sky like this. And with predators like hawks and owls, they're constantly scanning the ground like this. And that is because these birds are geared for survival. If there's anything I learned about birds, it is that everything they do and the way they're built and their behavior is geared to simply survive, and each day is a chance for them to survive. So these are some of the early drawings that I did. So you can see, maybe you'd say they're not bad, but they're certainly not up to what I was doing, what I do now. These are some of the birds that I've done more recently. These are all colored pencil. And other ones. And by the way, some of you who buy books, you will get a postcard that includes one of these birds. So you can see it in detail. People talk about spark birds. What is the bird you fell in love with that made you want to keep doing this? And there were actually two. The first was an Anna's hummingbird that would fly around the yard. Whenever I was near its feeder, it would go around my head making loud wing beats, which is a very aggressive kind of behavior, or it would come right in front of me and do this and fan its tail out, and that made me a little bit afraid because it was right there, it could poke my eye out. Not that it would actually do that. I read that you could get these little feeders and actually train these birds to come to your hand, and I thought it would take maybe a month to do that, if it would even ever do that. But I bought this feeder and I set it out on table, seeing if it would take an interest. Well, these hummingbirds, they tend to claim every single feeder as their own immediately. So it came, it investigated, flew off, came back, investigated, started drinking from it. I moved it closer to me and closer, and finally I had it on my hand, and almost immediately, the hummingbird came and landed on my hand and started to feed. You could feel these little scratchy feet. It was, incredible that this wild creature was there on my hand. And I would talk to it, you're such a brave boy. And it is a boy. When you see that very brilliant reddish raspberry head, that's what a male has. The females have just a little bit of red at their throats. So I'm looking at this, I see the pattern of the feathers, I talk to the bird, the hummingbird looks up at me, I see the eyes, we're acknowledging each other, and then it bends down and drinks some more. I was in love. The other was this spark bird. There's a bird at the feeder. It looks like a baby bird. It's all fluffy, and I thought it was a baby bird and said, oh, how cute. Its eyes were kind of half closed. I thought, oh, it's so tired. It's been flying. It needs to rest. And then the bird flew to me and landed on me, and I knew that was very abnormal. And I started seeing that the bird was not able to eat. It had mess coming out of its bill and its back, and it was a sick bird. And at that time, I didn't know what it was. I found out it was an outbreak of salmonellosis, which is common when there is an outbreak among finches, house finches, pine siskins, goldfinches. And I had to take my feeders down because this was a bird that was going to be dead within the day. The puffed out part of it is that it can't thermoregulate anymore. And it's not able to eat as well. Now, I call this a spark bird because even though I was very sad and took the feeders down, it made me aware of the life of individual birds, not just a whole species, not just birds in general. And it really provided me an entryway into the world of conservation. Because when you love birds, you want to save them, even individuals. And I had that feeling after seeing this bird. Most of what this book is, and I'm not going to go through all of it, most of what is in this book is my observations of behavior of birds. And now you have to know, I started doing this when I only knew there were 3 birds in my yard, and I didn't even know the correct names for them. And that's an important thing to note because some people want to they think I'm never going to go birding because you have to know all these names and you have to know what the birds are before you do that. And then you check it off the list and you have these expensive binoculars, you're in the park, and there are people saying, there's Blackburnian warbler. You don't hear what they're saying. And so it's very off-putting. And I'm going to say there are many, many ways to bird. Some of them are, just to go through the park on a nice walk and you might notice a bird. And the kind of birding I do is I just sit at my dining room table or in the yard and I bird watch. So I go birding with people as well, these experts who can identify all the birds in the park. Or in Ecuador, I was there as well. But the birding that I love to do the most is simply sitting in my backyard and watching these birds. And I didn't know the names. The first birds I noticed, there was a crow, of course. We all know crows. The second was a hummingbird. I didn't know what kind. And the third was what I called a blue jay. You have blue jays in New York. We don't. We have scrub jays. So I learned the name later. These are actually, so this is just an example of their fledgling oak titmice. They're actually in my yard now and I'm missing out on it. And it was just documenting the kind of things these babies had to learn. You think that babies come out of the egg and are able to sing and they're able to pick up food and eat and all of that, and they can't. They even have to learn how to swallow. They'll pick up something, it may be a seed, it may be an acorn that's too big, it may be a piece of poop, and they hold it in their bill and they're like this, waiting for somebody to shove it down their throat. So they have to learn all of that. If they don't learn this within 2 or 3 weeks, they're basically a dead bird. About 75% of these birds never make it to adulthood. So when you see an adult bird, they're kind of a miracle. They're the hardiest of them. They survive. They're still there as an adult. That was shocking to me. When people talk about, oh, the baby bird, it's fallen out, it's fine, leave it for his parents. And that is sort of true, but you want to take it out of the reach of somebody who might step on it or a cat that might take it and all of that. These birds are actually more fragile than you think. I'll just, just a few of this. This is one of my favorites because there were crows that kept coming to the feeders and displacing the little birds, and I thought, what can I do? Well, I can't kill the crows. I can't do a slingshot or something. I'm a bird conservationist. And so I found at Wild Birds Unlimited a fake crow. I think it was like $14. It came with some chicken feathers stuck to it. And I'd read something about crows actually mourning their fallen comrades. And so I hung this bird, this crow, upside down so it would look like it had endured a mighty battle and lost. And you can see that the crows, soon enough, really fast, they came flying from all directions, not just one direction, but it seemed like the word goes out really fast, and they come from everywhere. It's like the relatives showing up from all parts of the country to go to a funeral. And they were all screaming, they were in the tree and screaming, and they, I imagine there, people saying, "Oh, it's Squawky Jr., what happened, who killed him?" And the stool pigeon says it was a human did it and laughed, So I ended up doing these little captions. At the same time, I was telling myself, don't anthropomorphize what's going on in the yard. And I allowed the humor to seep in, but the behavior is actually real. I was trying to look at it objectively and just describe what was happening and not determine the intentions of the bird, because I can't do that. I'm not a bird, or I try to be, but I cannot know the exact intentions of these birds. I did things like, how do birds make the sounds that they make? They have a syrinx, not a larynx, and they can do like double voices and singing and all these trills and amazing songs, but I would never be able to imitate any of them, although I was able to do an intonation with hummingbirds, and it goes like this. And that was enough to have the hummingbird answer back with its call and then come to me. Now, I think that the call actually means I'm going to take your feeder if you don't come here right away. It's not like, hey, it's Amy, come and say hello. So it was definitely something that got the bird's attention and came to me. And then this is just something where I was noticing in slow motion that the tail that moves as it's upright and goes back and forth, actually a sound, a clicking sound accompanies that. And it may be that it's not that it has to move its tail to make a sound, but my guess is that it served as a bellows as the tail went up against the belly, that it pushed the air out and made it easier for it to make a sound. Or it just liked to do it, like in rhythm, like dancing, So as I said, I'm always looking at these survival issues, and these were scrub jays that are fledglings. They had to learn how to use the feeder. The parent is down below in the middle saying, this is the last regurgitation. And that was often true. I would see these parents feeding their birds right there on the ground, and then they'd take off. And the bird would try to follow, the fledgling would try to follow, and the parents would come back fewer times until they never came back. And so the little young fledglings were on their own. I think they stick around, the parents stick around for about 2 weeks, and then they have to leave. Otherwise, these birds will never learn to feed themselves, and they will die. So there were birds that were, these little birds, as I said, they can't differentiate food from poop. And there were finches that, if you have bird feeders, you know this to be true. When you have finches on a bird feeder, they throw about 5 seeds down on the ground for every one they eat. So lucky scrub jays were able to eat what had been thrown on the ground, but it was kind of beneath them, I think. They wanted to master it themselves. So this little scrub jay, he failed, and then he would try when the mother went away. He tried, and he was on the feeder, and I went back an hour later, and he was still at it. And when I thought about these birds and what makes corvids so smart, corvids are crows, ravens, and these jays, and I said part of it is persistence, as is true for many human beings as well. Somebody said early on in Facebook, I went to a bird page and I said, so what kind of food should I get for a junco? Now, a junco is a sparrow, and all sparrows, I found out, are ground feeders. And the person said to me, why don't you get a bird book and know what you're looking at before you ask questions here? And so instead of, I did get a bird book, a guide. But I also said, well, why is it that they're ground feeders? What's to keep them from eating from a feeder? Is it the way their feet are shaped, that they can't hang on to the feeder? Is it that they sense danger when they're on the feeder? They're used to hiding in bushes on the ground, and so on and so forth. And I did my own experiment. And this is based in part on about 5 years of work I did in the field of developmental disabilities. And my job was really to observe children birth to 5 and just note what captured their attention and how you could gradually increase their attention, and this thing of adaptive behavior, how can you have them problem solve as well? So this hermit thrush, Cornell Lab says, never goes to the feeder, and it's also a secretive bird, so you'll rarely see this bird. So this bird came out, and I put the cages down on the ground. It learned to get in. I raised them, and then they were suspended like all the other feeders that the non-sparrows or hermit thrush would go in. And that bird there spent, I don't know how long, it's 20 minutes or longer, trying to figure out how to get into this cage. It clearly wanted, and eventually it succeeded. But you never have birds staying that long. It's actually, I look back, and it's kind of a bad thing to have birds stay out in the open for that period of time. You see them, they land, and then they're gone a few seconds later, unless they're eating or they're drinking or bathing. But again, a really persistent bird. It's crashing into the bars. It doesn't give up. Now, one of the things that I noticed about these birds, I have migrating birds, and this is a bird that comes during migration. But there was another bird that comes from Alaska or northern Canada. It's called the golden-crowned sparrow, which you don't have here. And they come in droves. So my yard at some point in time during the winter has these birds as the most common bird of my yard. I started noticing that when the birds came during migration, some of them flew directly into these cage feeders that I had made. And earlier, when I first made them, the birds had to spend a great deal of time figuring out how to get through these openings. And after a while, they mastered it, and then they could just jump in and out. So when I saw these birds flying in the adults in their breeding plumage, dark brows, neon yellow crown, and they flew directly into these cages, I knew that they had been in my yard before. So that whole question, do birds, they fly all the way to Alaska or northern Canada and they come, do they remember where they were before? And my answer is, I think so. I'm never sure about anything, but the fact that the adult birds could just fly in and knew exactly what was in there was telling to me. And that the young birds, they call them first winter, they're young, this is the first winter they've had, they're going to spend here now in my yard. they didn't know how to get in, and they had to spend the time to figure out how to do that. I also found, I was fascinated with what aggression that birds were doing. Like, they are, I had created this artificial situation by putting feeders there. Birds, when they're in the wild, they're in their portion of the tree. They're not always feeding next to each other. So some of the behavior that you'd see at a feeder is kind of unusual, although they will compete for, say, crevices and places to nest. But these were different species of birds, and some of them were smaller than others. And I will say they had their strategies. The one that worked the best, no matter how small a bird you were, was to leap behind another bird. So there would be a big bird, it commandeered the food, and the little birds couldn't get close to it. But the little bird then would fly, land right behind. That bird took off. The little bird took the food it had been eating and took off with that. So that worked. These birds are, I just found that they're incredibly smart in ways that we have never known. And this is an example, the scrub jay. It was, I had a cage feeder and I put suet in for the other birds, but it would like tug on, it was a bowl in the middle, so it couldn't reach in and get it. But it would knock the rocks off that were surrounding it and then pull it, knock it this way, and pretty soon it would be next to the side and it would eat up all the suet. So I thought, well, that was pretty clever. So I put a white silicone pad so it couldn't slide it very easily. The next day there was white confetti all over the patio. Then I took some branches and I threaded them through all the openings. The next day the branches were on the ground. Then I took very heavy dowels and I put that through. The next day they were sawn in half and on the ground. So this, I was really admiring the intelligence of this bird to adapt and use its skills. At the very end, I put in bricks on all sides of the bowl. So you can imagine that is not something this bird's going to be able to move. It's a cage, bricks, and a small bowl in the middle. What it did was it stuck its entire head in. This is a 1.5-inch opening, stuck its entire head in there to eat. And that was a very risky maneuver, but this is like the last of it, you know, this kind of risky behavior, going back to a bird's need to survive. Not that this bird was starving, but it's the notion of persistence that is part of their inventory of tools for surviving. Anyway, I have, they're kind of the bane of my backyard, but they also, I love them because they're so smart. Again, this is adaptation behavior I was looking at. This is a very chubby California towhee trying to get in that same cage. And it, you know, it's pressed up against, there's no way it can get in. It goes around to all four sides and tries to see if the openings were bigger. And then there was another bird, a white-throated sparrow, which is a much smaller bird, and you have them in the park. They're a very common bird in the park. And it just jumped in and jumped out. And the towhee looked at it and jumped in and jumped out. And you wonder, how did it do that when it was trying to squeeze through and it couldn't, and it just smoothly went in? This is what we call why we call these birds shapeshifters. How they do that, I still don't know, because it doesn't look, when he did it, it didn't look like it even ruffled its feathers going in and out. So again, these birds will persist and try something until they succeed, and it was very heartening to me. There's something about persistence that also goes along with the notion of hope. And there's a very well-known poem by Emily Dickinson, and it goes, the first line is, "Hope is the thing with feathers." And these beautiful creatures, they provide many metaphoric and real lessons for us. What's fun to a bird? You wonder if a bird is doing something. Is it just, catatonic, or what is it doing? Why does it do the same thing? And one day we had to drain the cistern, which is about 4,000 gallons. The water had become contaminated. And it was draining down a retaining wall. And this towhee started sliding down. It became a water slide. They would go to the top and slide down again. And there were other birds watching, like spectators. It was like the Olympics of bird water sliding. And I just thought, are they playing? What is play to a bird? And again, one of these areas where I was very careful, I said, don't anthropomorphize, but look at the elements. A bird does something over and over again without really any useful function, like to get to food or something, or to drink the water. So why? And I think it is evidence of play, and I had other examples of birds just swinging and doing other things. And like our athletes, people who play baseball, who do gymnastics, that these are skills of physical prowess, and it's fun, and you're showing that you can do this. And I think that the fun things that birds do have much to do with physical prowess and balance and other things like that. I just, once you start doing bird watching, I think you'll see that there's some birds that seem shy, some birds that are very bold and aggressive. The titmice are very funny. They're little birds with crests, and they will scold you even though they're just a pipsqueak. So I love noticing these characteristics of birds. Bully birds, birds that the hermit thrush just turns its back to the aggressor, which is maddening. I think if you had it's kind of a passive-aggressive move, right? It's not passive-aggressive in the bird world, but it is a maneuver that these birds do, and I still want to know why. What is its intention in doing that, ignoring? This particular bird was, it was a house finch, female, and it kept flying in front of the window back and forth. People will say birds will do that if they see their reflection and it's courting time and they think it's another male, and they will peck at the window and do this. But this was a female, and she was not pecking the window. She's just flying back and forth looking at me. They know me by now as the large flightless creature who brings food. So it's looking at me, and eventually I noticed its favorite feeder was empty. And it flew over to another cage feeder, a seed feeder, and it would sit on the hoop net there and look at me. And then it would fly back to the other one and fly back and forth, and it was like, is this bird really communicating with me? Is it trying to tell me the feeder is empty? So I went outside, I filled that feeder, and the finch waited on the rail nearby. And then as soon as it was filled and I put it back in, the finch went onto the feeder and just ate and ate. Didn't say thank you, but stop that behavior. I've had that too happen when I've taken feeders down if there's an outbreak of something. But the funny thing, these birds, I have these feeders in front of my bathroom window. So these birds are only this far away from me. And when I took the feeders down, I found that there were birds I never knew were there, birds I wanted to see, and they were right there, and they'd stare at me as I walked, and they would tap, not this persistent tapping that birds do when they see a competitor. It was a little polite tap, like, yoo-hoo, I'm here. And I knew that they were looking at me because when I moved to another window, it would follow me and stare at me and then tap again. And if I opened the door, sometimes they would fly in. I did that with even the front door. It followed me everywhere I was going in the house and somehow knew. I opened the front door, it came in and flew in, perched on something and stared at me. A lot of birds will come into a house, fly all over the house, panicked, and crash into things. This bird just perched and stared at me like, food? So I just have found in so many ways they're smarter than we think. A lot of times when I was taking these notes down, I even came across ethical questions about morality. One was having to do with, do I feel any sympathy for these mealworms, for example, that are going to be food? I mean, they were struggling. I just knew that they had some sense. Their life was in danger. You know, you could hear this sizzling kind of sound as they're moving against each other. And when I had them out there, the yellow jackets would come and eat them, start eating them, you know, slowly biting into them, and they'd be like moving around still in the yellow jacket mouth. And I thought about the yellow jackets, they were keeping away the birds from getting that. So I put together a yellow jacket trap. You know, you put sugar water, a little dog food, you hang it up. And sure enough, these yellow jackets went into that concoction. And soon they were in the water, and they were getting on these pieces of dog food that are rolling around like logs in the water. And other yellow jackets came, and I read somewhere, yellow jackets actually recognize each other. So I imagine the yellow jackets looking at them and say, Myrtle, wait, I'm gonna come, I'm gonna bring help, just be patient, you know. Jack, you know, I can't hang on much longer. And this drama that's happening there, and I thought, oh my God, they really want to live. And it made me question my feeling that you are sort of looking, your degree of compassion is sort of phylogenetically based, you know. The animals at the top, the pretty faces, you know, you sympathize with them. The live mealworms, not so much. So I had this question. I hate this expression, the circle of life. People would look at this and say, hey, it's the circle of life. This eats that, blah, blah, blah. But I think that circle of life is a cliche that blunts our emotions, and that we should feel and consider the desire for every living thing to want to live. And that's part of our circle of thought, our circle of you know, consideration as we go through what we morally believe is compatible with other beliefs that we have. This is just I finally had birds that nested in a nest box. I accidentally opened the nest box when I thought it was empty, and there was a mother bird, and she flew out. And I got to watch this whole process of the male and the female building the nest, laying the eggs, and these nestlings that were inside. And also then these nestlings becoming fledglings, coming to the feeders and learning how to fly and jump, and missing the feeders the first few times and falling. And seeing that some of these one of the fledglings would turn into the leader, the fearless one that others would follow. So I got to see this whole life cycle with some of these birds. And I will mention that if you ever find a baby bird and you can touch it, the parents will not abandon it. It's perfectly fine. Pick it up, put it in a box, put it somewhere safe. You find an injured bird, take it to a rehab center. If you find a bird that has hit a window, take it to a rehab center. Even though they seem to be fine and fly off, they often have internal injuries. This is something that a lot of people tell me about, you know, the most scientific people, intellectual people, that somebody will die and they'll say, you know, after my dear one died, there was a certain bird that came to me and just paid company, you know, just sat there and looked at me. And I just had the feeling it was the person I loved. This is so widespread. And I think, again, it goes to the fact that hope is the thing with feathers. Somehow we attribute a lot of our hope to this very small creature who is, in some ways, because it can fly, is mythical. It represents freedom. And I had that sense when two friends of mine died suddenly of heart attacks. They were married. And these unusual birds, a purple finch, American robin, came, but also this chipmunk, a Sonoma chipmunk, which just does not exist in my area, showed up all within a half an hour. And I said, well, Asa didn't believe, they were doctors, they didn't believe in this stuff. But then I could hear Asa, who's very loud and, the kind of guy who would announce, I'm here, pay attention to me. I could imagine him saying, how many times do I have to get into animal drag before you admit that really is me? So, I took comfort from that, and whether this is true or not, it doesn't matter. I did some scientific research, and one of them was that these owls, a pair of owls, a mother and her baby son, came to live in our yard. And so I got to see them every day. Lou and I began the day as our junior and mom here. Yes, and we go look at them. And, they have these big, gleamy yellow eyes. And one day, I asked myself, I need to capture the different moods of an owl. So there's a certain look they have when there's just a resting face, or there's a certain look they have when their mother is looking at her young son. And I documented that, as you can see. So we have resting face, we have sexy face, happy face, mother love face, hangry face, and attack human face. And many people have thanked me for that attack human face so they can avoid a serious bad outcome if they do not recognize that with an owl. I'm going to close with one slide that has to do with the fact that if you love birds, you'll want to save them, you'll want to protect them. And these windows, we have windows around every side of our house, expansive windows with the view of the bay and Angel Island. And I had enough, once a year a bird would hit the window and die. And it was so tragic to me. I needed to prevent it. And I tried many different things. And what I found worked was taking a white acrylic pen and drawing spider webs all over the windows so that when the birds started flying there, they'd put on the brakes and not hit the glass. But this notion of conservation goes to many ways that are being done. As a consequence of falling in love with birds, I joined the board of American Bird Conservancy, and I'm learning exactly how conservation is done, often with restoration or through acquiring habitat to expand the habitat these particular bird species live in. And for many species, it is habitat specific. So you get rid of that habitat, you will get rid of that species. But what also happens is when our environment changes, as your colon ice exhibit is pointing out so dramatically, that this affects all of the ecology that birds relate to. So birds tend to migrate. They migrate when the temperature reaches a certain level. And say they're going back to Alaska, and they're expecting that their food, their insects, are going to come out of hibernation. But the insects depend on the ice melting and for the temperatures to then go up to a point where they're available. So you can have this crossover that doesn't match in the timing, birds arriving too early and finding there's no food there. So that is a disaster for these birds. Most of these birds can recover, one species, one group going to a different area. But if this happens, if this becomes something ongoing, you're going to see the devastation of a lot of species, not just of birds, but all the animals up this chain that depend, insects. There are fewer insects, fewer birds, fewer bigger predators, and so on and so forth. So I've become very aware of that. My hope for you with this book is that you laugh a lot when you see what's in there, but that you also look at your own birds in whatever way is enjoyable to you, that you fall in love with birds, and that you also will want to save them. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy, and we'll take questions from you in a moment. I have a few myself, but let me just ask you, Amy, how, I mean, you and your family have had quite an odyssey that brings you to this. And I'm wondering, when you look back at your life, and the life of your mother, of course, how do you divide it up? I mean, what are the chapters that you see yourself as having gone through to get to here?
You know, one thing that I have in common that started when I was very young is that I was an observer. And I looked at behavior, especially of my mother, because my mother was very temperamental, and she was given to threats of suicide, and she actually would make attempts at times. So I was very observant of her moods. I would just see what shifts were going on, how she was dressed, whether or not she was smiling. Did she put on lipstick? Did she look at my father? Did she look away? Did she bang pans? Those kinds of things when I was very, very young, as well as the different languages that were spoken and when they were spoken, and the secrets that were told in one language and not the other. That, as you can see, feeds in directly to the kind of skills I have as an observer, whether it's my mother or whether it's birds. And just sitting back and noting that, which later, of course, fed into stories, my observations of what was happening in my family. And my family had also, the theme of survival is huge in my family. My mother had a terrible first marriage. She was this arranged marriage to a pilot who was a national hero. He was somebody who was bringing women home for the day that they were married. He was abusive. He was a gambler. She couldn't get out of this marriage. She fell in love with a man who was a Christian, a very devout Christian, who was going to become a minister, and they had a love affair. And she was put in jail, eventually tried to kill herself there. So this was a great love story, drama in my mother's life, which then gets communicated, although in unknowing ways, to me, that I am raised with this, the secrets, the drama, the pain, and the means that you use to take care of those feelings, my mother's uncontrollable feelings. What also happened is that my father and brother developed brain tumors in the same year. So again, a story of survival in the family and observing what's going on, being scared but not being able to talk to anybody about this. My brother died after 6 months of a pinealoma, and my father died 6 months after him. They were separate, 2 weeks before my brother died, my father was diagnosed, and he died of a glioblastoma. So this double tragedy, of course, there's no way that you can get through this as a young fiction writer without considering everything that goes on, why this happens, how people react, what do you believe in, what have you discarded as your beliefs. And so that very much influenced me. So those are the things that go into the fiction, the stories, the secrets, but also when looking at these birds, just the questions of survival is a big one for me, and morality, looking at how I feel about these birds and what's going to happen, and should I have any role in their lives.
Well, I guess you also learned how to be an observer. I'm kind of curious, though, how you felt you survived all of this to get to the point where you had the equanimity to write a book, write a novel, to do these bird drawings.
I think that I would have had a very different life if I hadn't met a certain boy at the age of 18. It was not love at first sight. He was a nice guy, and I was really after that kind of moody rebel who would probably turn into a drug addict later and write poetry that never got published. That was the kind of guy that I was looking for. And this guy was just really nice, and he didn't, he was just very polite. And that guy is sitting in the
Hey,
audience
Lou,
today.
will you
He's
stand up and
Lou.
take a bow?
Yeah. Anyway, we've been together for 54 years. And I really, truly think that, I had a lot of things in my life because of the background with my mother and my father and the deaths, where I would have been a little bit prone to just going off balance. And that sometimes happens to me, but I can regain my equanimity. Lou has this expression he often has to use, and I give him this permission to do it. We've had talks about it. And it's, let it go, Amy. Just let it go. And then it's like, oh yeah, I have to do this. Just let it go. Because I can obsess the same way that my mother obsessed. And it's really a very unhealthy thing, especially knowing there's nothing I can do about the situation I'm obsessing about.
So is just sitting quietly and watching birds a kind of a helpful meditation for you?
It's a reset. If you can't get your mind off something that is, you're just obsessing, you're in despair, you're depressed, what can you do? You're sitting in the same place where something happened. Going out in nature just changes everything. It's such a dramatic difference between where you usually are, probably. And then to pay attention to something you've never noticed before, a bird, and just keep watching it. Don't need to know the name of the bird, you just keep watching what it's doing and wondering why it's doing exactly that. Why does it jump from branch to branch? Why does it never stay still? Any of those questions, and you don't even need to know the answers, because the whole thing about observing that makes it so delightful is that you can, your curiosity just generates these questions, and then you're always interested. To be interested in something in your life is a huge part of the pleasure that we have. Interest, wonder, awe, and then feeling these other deeper feelings when you see something that's very sad. That is meaningful too, that we have what's in us as compassion or grief, that we're feeling this deeply.
And yet this world of birds, indeed the world of almost everything, is this incredibly delicately calibrated little universe. And here we are living in this era where everything is being disturbed.
It is, and you just wonder, where is it going? I mean, you and I, we could just sit here and say, well, we're not going to be here in 50 years to see what's happened to our world. What's really important is, we don't have kids, but we have a goddaughter now lives next to us, and these two children I'm very fond of. One of them takes care of the birds when I'm gone, but I look at them, and when I think about the future, that's who I think about, that we have to take it to the next generation and looking at why it's so important. We can, be aware of these facts and figures, but it has to come with this huge desire to enable us for Earth's survival and the survival of our species, survival of kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, what is going to be left of the world by the time they reach our age. You see it in the mood of these generations of young people when you ask them, and they're the ones who have a sense of, am I ever going to get anywhere in this? What's it all for? Will I have children in the future? And it's tragic. And so these are the questions that I think we have to concern ourselves with, and we can see it most clearly mirrored in the eyes of the young people.
Yeah, and I encourage you all to see the exhibit that we have up on climate change and the effect it's having on the glaciers of the Himalayas and every river system in Asia. But in a certain sense, it's a kind of, I felt quite tranquil reading your book, but it is a world that is so fragile, as a metaphor almost for every...
Fragile, but at the same time, it can be resilient, as long as you don't put adversity in the way of these birds. So birds naturally, they had if none of them died and billions kept going, you'd have one problem. You'd wipe out all the insect population, and there are many animals that depend on insects. But if you kill off a little too many birds at one point, then you are on a downward spiral and can kill off a whole species. You know, one of the great things, and this is not a popular sentiment with a lot of people, but one of the biggest killers of birds that relates to humans are cats. Yeah. Cats are the ones that are responsible for between 1 to 3 billion deaths of birds every year, and that's in the United States. Window collisions is another one, but by far it is cats. And it kind of drives me crazy when people say, well, a cat is an apex animal. Again, circle of life. They belong at the top. They can kind of kill birds, use them as playthings. Or it's cruel to keep a cat inside. Or my cat is outside for only an hour. It's, all of these reasons. And I had a cat. So I know going from an outdoor cat to indoor cat, it's not that hard. And so I would just say,
cat.
Or no cat. No, I think cats are great companions. They're wonderful, wonderful pets. But they'll live. The bells don't work when you have a little nest of baby birds and they're on the ground, right. And they won't run away. The cats, and I've seen that happen. I've seen the cat going up to, and the parent bird screaming and screaming as the cat gets closer and closer. So you have a lot of ground nesting birds, or birds in bushes, or birds, in trees. And cats can climb and they can get to these things. So your sweetest cat will kill a bird, and they may not eat it. They'll play with it like a toy, and then it'll be, once a cat gets a bird, it's usually a bird that will not survive. Even if it's not killed, these puncture wounds will cause infections, and the birds will be killed. So please, if you have a cat, please consider not putting the cat outside. I know it's a hassle with the kitty litter box, but think about, I hope you fall in love with birds and not want your cats to kill all these beautiful birds.
And then, Amy, remember when back in the 1950s, Chairman Mao launched
to get rid of what, magpies?
It was sparrows.
Sparrows.
And they had people going out banging cans and pots until the sparrows fell out of the air. And what happened? Catastrophe, because there was no birds around to eat the bugs, and the crops got decimated.
Yeah. I know, you disturb the system, and it has wide-reaching effects that you're not even aware of. So yes, like overpopulation of birds, underpopulation of birds. How does that affect this? And there is a problem with fewer insects out there. And I'm not sure what the reasons are, but this could have impact in certain areas where there are few insects, and that's the food that certain animals depend on, not just birds. You have snakes and lizards and frogs and fish.
But they're on the run too. I mean, we've come to, I think, when you were young and I was young, and we were just out in the natural world naturally.
Yeah.
Now, how many of your kids are out, have a creek in the back of their yard?
You would never let them in the creek by themselves all day long, would you?
Well, there might not be anything to see in the creek either.
I would just go out there and get in trouble and climb over barbed wire fence and cut myself up and catch snakes and fall down the sides of, the creek bank and all of this. And it was my immersion into nature that was so great. It was such a great experience.
Yes, and a lot of videos and documentaries of nature don't quite do the trick the same way. I wonder about that. Well, listen, there are a lot of things we could wonder about for a long time, but let's let you all wonder a bit, simply to say that this book is really a wonderful evocation of something that's we've just always assumed would be out there. Birds.
Yeah, that's really a number of people have said that, you'd think that somebody would have done this before. I never imagined this as a book. I did these journals for a number of years. I had 9 of them or more, and in addition to practice journals. And it was my editor who said to me, why don't we publish this? He had only seen the pretty birds. And I said, that's not what this book is about. My journal is all these sketches, they're observations. And he said, no, I think that's what we want. And he looked at it, and lucky for me, Knopf and the group of people there also agreed this would be a book that was publishable and that, other people might enjoy.
Well, questions from you. I can hardly see you, but maybe.
How many of you are bird lovers, bird watchers, so quite a few.
Quite a few. Well,
you go to Central Park, you see people, I see, yes.
Yeah. But Central Park is really quite a haven.
Oh, and it's migration, it's spring migration. You can get 25 warblers in one morning if you go there and, go with somebody. If you don't know what a warbler looks like or all these different species, there are people in the park and you can just follow them or go with somebody who's an expert. Join the Audubon Society in New York City, NYC Audubon, and they have groups that will take you and help you. And it's fun. You don't have to know anything about birds, and see if you like it. But I think it's a great way to get your exercise, go out in the park, look at something, you feel you have a purpose as you're getting your walk in.
All right, so someone has a microphone we can't see, so speak up, tell us who you are, and a nice short question.
Hi, okay, yeah, thank you very much. This is amazing. I'm Shelley. I'm a scientist, but I've recently gotten into doing a lot of urban sketching and plein air sketching, and so I found it really helps me visualize my work differently. And I was just curious, from your perspective, kind of the physical act of sketching and drawing the birds as you're journeying, rather than directly writing about it, kind of how you feel like that adds to this experience for you, and then also if you've seen the world beyond birds differently through the drawing and sketching.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part. Do I feel I can go out and, it sounded like you were saying enshrine the birds? No.
Oh, sorry, I can speak slower.
It's because the acoustics are such that things drop out.
Oh, okay,
So
sorry,
yeah.
I was curious, the physical act of drawing and sketching the birds rather than, maybe directly writing about your observations, if that that process adds a lot, and then if it helps you see the world beyond birds differently too.
Oh, I see. It's both. Nature journaling means that I'm doing both at the same time. I'm sketching the birds, I'm writing about what I'm seeing. It's always the two of those things together. So it's not simply writing. It's not simply drawing a pretty picture. In fact, some of the sketches are very rough. You don't see the roughest ones there, but sometimes I only have 5 seconds to capture something. And I can just do a horizontal and a vertical line and a midline to know what the posture of the bird was in that behavior, and I can draw it later, but taking copious notes then of what is being seen. I don't know if that was what you were asking in your question, but I think that people who want to do nature journaling, it's again like birding, you can do it any way you want. You could just write about it, do a little something representing a worm or a seed or the whole bird or whatever, but it is only the idea that you are wondering about what you're seeing, you're curious, and you're writing it down, which would enable you to remember it better. There are also studies that show that this can make you smarter. And I think part of it is that you're paying longer attention and you're making correlations and seeing patterns. And certainly it is found to be true with young kids that things like this kind of activity can really help them and make them smarter in whatever ways you think of what smarter is. Longer attention span, being able to discern certain things more quickly. But that tends to be true. And when we get older, we need all the brain we can keep. Right. So I've heard that this eye-hand thing in drawing can increase white matter in this area called the precuneus in the brain, and I think, I'll take it. You know, when I start losing white matter, I've got a little backup supply. So that's something to think about,
the
too.
brain is a muscle. By the way, I wanted to ask you, mealyworms, can you order them in Amazon? I mean, how do you
Yeah,
get
you actually
20,000?
can.
You can?
You actually can, but you know, what they're doing, Amazon is just you know, it's the ordering center, and
Is
so
it
they
dry
go
mealyworms
to,
or
you can get
live?
dry, you can get live,
Yeah.
and the live ones tend to be expensive. I order mine either from the local bird store, but when I started getting into 20,000, that was more than what they were carrying.
Was this, do you have a truck back up to your house?
Now, they're very light, so you could get 20,000. It's not, you know, it's not like, you know. But I started ordering them directly from the distributor at Rainbow Mealworms. You can order all kinds of disgusting things from Rainbow
Write this
Mealworms.
down, your bulk orders of mealworms.
If you have a lizard, you can get these, you know, other kind of larvae that are quite delicious according to whatever.
All right, next.
And I just have to tell you,
Yeah.
I had a group of people, conservationists, with a group called Point Blue Conservation Science. And I had a luncheon for them, and just as a joke, I had all this Chinese food out, you know, like 8 different courses, and I put a bowl of mealworms out, and I just set that, because I
someone eat
knew
them?
they would know what it was. And they looked at it, and the one woman who is the wife of a very incredibly talented artist, birder, and she helps run these tours, she said, "Oh, mealworm," and she just popped it in her mouth. And she's eating it. Then her husband picks it up, and he eats one. He says, kind of like cardboard a little bit, with a pop of moisture at the end. And then another ornithologist picked, and I thought, I should have filmed this, because it would have been a TikTok that would have made them a lot of money. So disgusting.
Well, you know the Chinese joke that in China, we eat
flies
everything
or-
with 4 legs
yeah.
but a table.
Yeah,
Except,
yeah.
you know. All right, next question, wherever it is.
Hi. First of all, I saw your, the first time I saw your bird drawings was on that Netflix special about you. And I showed it to my daughter, and I told her, I said, I wish you would put it in a book, because I always wonder how I can get one of your drawings, but then now you have it in a book.
Well,
so
you have, if you bought a book, I think most people got a postcard with their book.
Yeah, and you can
I
get a
did
book
not get
afterwards.
one.
Yeah, if you bought a book, there should be a postcard there of the drawings. I do not sell my original drawings.
Yeah.
It is, I think of my art in a different way. It's not a commercial thing. It's something I do for my pleasure. It is in this. The only drawing I've ever sold was an auction to benefit the National Poetry Series. So that's it. And it's an organization, I'm on their board. So it's a special organization to me. I don't know if that's what you were asking, how to get one of the drawings?
No, my question, well, thank you for telling me about that. But my question is, did you ever use your photographs?
Oh, photographs.
In
I'm
helping
sorry.
you
Yes.
draw
Yes.
also?
I do different kinds of drawing. One is called drawing live, plein air, where I'm sitting there, the bird is there, the landscape, whatever it is, and I'm just drawing very quickly what I see, and I can finish the drawing later at home. So that's like the very sketchy ones that you see here that are like these cartoons, and there's a video actually on Facebook, on my Facebook page, Amy Tan, and you'll see me doing a live drawing. I'm just drawing very quickly a junco, and you'll see my thought process that goes through as I'm drawing. And I drew this in about 2 minutes, and they've shortened it from there. But the other is when I do the very detailed drawings, I do use a reference photo, but I have my own rules about this. All the birds that I write about and observe are in my backyard. All the birds that I draw, these detailed paintings, they're birds that looked at me directly, and I use my own reference photos. I do not use somebody else's, because that would be a bird not taken in my yard. So those are, just the way I do it. But if you're going to learn how to do it and use reference photos, and that's great. There's some sites that are copyright free. And if you use somebody's photos that are not copyright free and your bird is going to look exactly like the photo, you should give credit to the source. So that was something that was ingrained in us in the nature journaling class.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more. Someone have the mic?
Hi, Amy. So I have a question here. Did you ever observe the crows besides the funeral scene that you did? And if you didn't, why?
Do I observe crows and what was the last part?
If you didn't, why? Did you feed
no,
them?
I see crows all the time, and I admire them a great deal because they're so incredibly smart, but they also have a very strong social system, very strong family system. So most birds will, the parents will take off after 2 weeks. Crows stay together. They can stay together as a unit for, it could be a year or 2 or 4 or a lifetime. And these crows, for example, it's not just the mother that feeds the birds. It could be a sibling, or it could be an uncle or an aunt. So they work together cooperatively as a family, and some other birds do that as well. You can see because they're so large, they're there, and you see the kind of behavior they do with each other. They groom, they pick nits out of, and the mother will swallow these things, making me think this is true love. Who would, if you're picking insects out like that. So there's a lot to observe with crows, not just as birds, but as the kind of birds that show us a lot about what we mean by family, or what we mean by supporting one another. And again, we're using these human analogs of behavior to look at birds, but I think it's a good starting point for understanding what are the traits of what birds are doing now, and what does that mean, and how is it enabling us to continue to see these birds out in the wild.
Crows and seagulls are rather abundant. Why is that in the case of crows?
Actually, crows are a little bit on the decline, really? Whereas ravens are on the increase. And I don't know all the answers. I'm not an expert in this, but I'm guessing that you're seeing a decline in the kind of habitat or the food they're eating, or wherever they're doing their nesting. Then ravens are, they eat carcasses, they eat many more things than, say, crows do. I do feel that birds that will tolerate a variety of habitats, a variety of foods, are the ones that tend to be the toughest survivors. So you see a lot of house sparrows in New York. In the urban areas, those little brown birds with the black masks, the males have the black masks. You see them everywhere. Those are house sparrows. They came from Europe. Those are on the decline in Europe, and who knows why. They're on the upswing here, and people, a lot of birders, hate them. And this is the thing, as somebody says, I found an injured house sparrow. Often people say on social media, oh, it's a foreign bird, kill it. And it reminds me of how, my parents were illegal, they didn't belong here, and they said, kill them. There's this total animosity toward things that don't belong. So it hits me in a different way when I hear that.
Immigrant birds.
Immigrant birds, they're migrant birds. We love migrant birds from Ecuador. We somehow don't like starlings and house sparrows. Seagulls, it depends. We call them gulls among, there's birder snobism. Don't get into it. So seagulls, they would never say seagulls, they say gulls. Many different kinds of gulls. Some of them are in the decline, and some of them are maintaining or increasing. So it's many different species of the same family, but they can have their ups and downs too.
Well, whatever the species, I would say birds are a kind of animal, like every kind of animal, which by and large are on the run, which is a sorry state of affairs.
Yeah.
Well, Amy, thanks so much. And this book, you may pick up a copy outside, and it's a really wonderful read.
Thank you, Orville. Thank you.